There is a quiet kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from physical work. It comes from thinking too much, from replaying conversations long after they are over, from imagining future problems that haven't happened, from analyzing decisions until even small choices feel heavy. Most people don't realize how much energy their mind burns every single day just circling the same thoughts. Overthinking rarely announces itself loudly. It disguises itself as responsibility, as preparation, as intelligence. You tell yourself you are just being careful. You are just considering every angle. You are just trying to avoid mistakes. But somewhere along the way, thinking stops being useful and starts becoming a trap. The mind is a powerful tool. It can imagine possibilities, solve problems, and protect you from danger. But it was never designed to run endlessly without rest. When it does, it creates tension, and that tension slowly becomes anxiety. Not because something is wrong in your life, but because your mind keeps searching for something that might be wrong. The strange thing about overthinking is that it often feels productive. You may spend hours mentally rehearsing a conversation you plan to have tomorrow. You may analyze why someone didn't respond to your message. You may create detailed scenarios of what could go wrong before starting a new project. In the moment, it feels like you are preparing. But afterward, you feel drained and no closer to peace. That's the first important realization. More thinking does not equal more control. In fact, it often creates the illusion of control while quietly increasing fear. The more you mentally simulate every negative possibility, the more real those possibilities begin to feel. Your body reacts as if the imagined future is already happening. Overthinking usually grows from a deep desire to feel safe. If you can predict everything, you believe you can avoid pain. If you can analyze every outcome, you believe you won't be surprised. But life doesn't operate within the limits of your mental simulations. No matter how much you prepare, uncertainty remains. And uncertainty is uncomfortable. The mind hates unfinished stories. When something is unclear, it fills in the blanks. If a friend sounds distant, your mind might assume you said something wrong. If your boss sends a short email, your mind might assume disappointment. Rarely does the mind fill in the blanks with neutral or positive interpretations. It tends to lean toward threat. This tendency comes from evolution. The brain evolved to detect danger. It scans for risk automatically. Thousands of years ago, this kept humans alive. Today, the danger is often social rejection, financial instability, or personal failure. The brain reacts to these perceived threats with the same urgency it once used to avoid predators. That's why overthinking feels intense. Your body doesn't know the difference between an imagined worst-case scenario and a real one. Your heart rate increases, your muscles tighten, your sleep becomes restless, and ironically, the more uncomfortable you feel, the more you try to think your way out of it. This creates a loop. You feel anxious, so you analyze. The analyzing makes you more anxious, so you analyze more. Eventually, thinking stops being a choice and becomes a habit, a default response to stress, a reflex. Many people don't realize they are caught in this loop because it feels normal. They have been doing it for years. They wake up already thinking. They go to bed still thinking. Silence feels unfamiliar. Stillness feels strange. But here is something worth considering. Clarity rarely comes from mental pressure. It comes from space. Have you ever noticed that your best ideas often appear when you are not trying so hard? When you are walking, showering, driving, or doing something simple? That's because the mind works best when it's relaxed. When you loosen your grip, it organizes itself naturally. Overthinking, on the other hand, is like trying to untangle a knot by pulling it tighter. The more force you use, the worse it becomes. Another hidden cost of overthinking is how it affects decisions. When you examine every option endlessly, you begin to doubt your own judgment. You start looking for perfect certainty. But perfect certainty does not exist. So you delay, you hesitate, you procrastinate, and the delay itself becomes another source of stress. The mind then criticizes you for not acting. It says you should have figured it out by now. It compares you to others who seem decisive and confident. But what you don't see is that decisive people are not necessarily smarter. They are simply more comfortable with imperfection. They accept that some level of uncertainty is unavoidable. Overthinking often creates new ones. Opportunities pass while you analyze. Relationships strain while you overinterpret. Confidence weakens while you second guess. There's also a subtle identity issue hidden here. Many intelligent, reflective people secretly take pride in their ability to think deeply. They associate overthinking with depth, with seriousness, with intelligence. So when someone suggests they might be thinking too much, it feels dismissive. But depth is not the same as rumination. Deep thinking is intentional and focused. It moves toward insight. Rumination is repetitive and circular. It moves nowhere. Learning the difference is essential, because the goal is not to stop thinking. The goal is to stop unnecessary thinking. Imagine if you could notice a thought without following it. Imagine recognizing that your mind is replaying something for the 10th time and gently choosing to shift your attention instead of diving deeper. That small shift is more powerful than it sounds. It doesn't require suppressing thoughts. Suppression usually makes them stronger. Instead, it requires awareness. Awareness creates distance, and distance reduces emotional intensity. The first step in changing any mental habit is noticing it without judgment. Not labeling yourself as anxious or weak. Not criticizing yourself for overthinking. Simply observing. When you observe your thoughts as events happening in your mind, rather than absolute truths, something changes. You realize that not every thought deserves engagement. Some are just background noise. And once you begin to see that, you start to reclaim your energy. Because overthinking is expensive. It consumes attention that could be used for living, for creating, for connecting, for resting. It steals presence from the current moment and places it in imaginary futures or rewritten pasts. Freedom from overthinking doesn't mean your mind becomes silent. It means you learn when to engage and when to let go. It means you stop treating every mental whisper as a command. The journey begins by understanding that your mind is not your enemy. It's simply overprotective. It learned to scan for problems because it believed that was its job. Now, you are going to teach it a new skill. You are going to teach it that not every possibility needs investigation. And once you begin practicing that, you'll discover something surprising. Beneath the noise, there is a steadiness you may have forgotten you had. In the next part of this journey, we'll explore why certain people are more prone to overthinking than others, and how early patterns quietly shape the way your mind reacts to the world today. If you've ever wondered why some people seem able to let things go while others replay a single sentence for days, the answer isn't random. Overthinking doesn't attach itself to people by accident. It usually grows from patterns that started much earlier than we realize. Some minds are trained, quietly and subtly, to be on high alert. Often, it begins in environments where mistakes felt costly. Maybe you grew up in a household where criticism was common, or where emotional reactions were unpredictable, or where love felt tied to performance. In those spaces, thinking carefully became a survival strategy. You learn to scan for subtle shifts in tone. You learn to predict moods. You learn to analyze situations before speaking. That habit once protected you. The problem is that the brain doesn't automatically update its strategies. What was once necessary can become excessive. The vigilance that helped you avoid conflict as a child can turn into constant rumination as an adult. Perfectionism is another powerful driver. When you believe that your worth depends on doing things flawlessly, your mind becomes a relentless editor. It reviews past actions, searching for errors. It rehearses future conversations, trying to eliminate every possible flaw. It magnifies small imperfections into significant threats. Perfectionism often hides behind ambition. From the outside, it looks like discipline or high standards. But internally, it feels like pressure. A quiet fear that if you misstep, something important will collapse. There's also the influence of personality. People who are naturally reflective, analytical, or sensitive tend to think deeply. They notice details others miss. They process emotions thoroughly. This can be a gift, but without boundaries, it can turn inward and become self-critical. Highly empathetic individuals are especially vulnerable. They replay interactions not only to understand themselves but to decode others. They ask questions like, "Did I upset them?" or "Did I say too much?" or "What did that expression mean?" Their desire to maintain harmony keeps the mental loop alive. Then there's certainty where none exists. Unanswered messages, undefined relationships, open-ended career paths. These situations don't just feel unclear, they feel unsafe. So your brain attempts to solve them internally, even when no real solution is available yet. Social media has amplified this tendency. In the past, interactions ended when you left the room. Now, they linger. You can read messages, rewatch stories, analyze timestamps, compare responses. The digital world gives the overthinking mind endless material. And because everyone's life appears polished online, comparison quietly intensifies. You begin measuring your progress, your relationships, your appearance against curated snapshots. The mind then asks, "Am I behind?" Did I choose wrong? Should I be doing more? Comparison fuels rumination because it creates imagined standards that constantly shift. Another layer beneath overthinking is the fear of rejection. Humans are wired for connection. Being excluded once meant survival risk. That wiring still exists. So when someone seems distant, or when you feel misunderstood, the mind reacts strongly. It tries to decode what went wrong. It searches for the exact moment things shifted. It imagines alternative behaviors you could have chosen. It creates hypothetical corrections. But these mental rehearsals rarely change reality. They simply exhaust you. Control is another hidden factor. When life feels unpredictable, thinking becomes a substitute for action. If you can't control outcomes, you try to control scenarios in your head. You analyze every possibility, hoping preparation will reduce discomfort. But thinking about an outcome does not influence it. It only changes your internal state. There's also a subtle addiction element to overthinking. The mind seeks resolution. Each time you engage with a thought, you feel like you are getting closer to closure. Occasionally, you do reach a satisfying conclusion. That small reward reinforces the behavior. Your brain learns that thinking might eventually provide relief. So it keeps going. But most loops don't end with clarity. They end with fatigue. Interestingly, overthinking often increases during transitional periods. New jobs, new relationships, major decisions. Anytime identity feels unstable, the mind works harder to define and defend it. You may notice that during stable phases of life, your thoughts feel calmer. But when change enters, rumination spikes. This is not weakness. It's adaptation. The brain is trying to protect you during uncertainty. However, constant mental rehearsal has consequences. It narrows your focus. When you are trapped in analysis, you miss subtle joys around you. Conversations become background noise. Experiences feel less vivid. Your body may be present, but your attention is elsewhere. Over time, this disconnect can create a sense of dissatisfaction. You may think something is wrong with your life, when in reality, your attention has simply been hijacked. Sleep also suffers. Nighttime removes distractions. The quiet invites unresolved thoughts to surface. Without external input, the mind fills the space with unfinished business. That's why worries feel louder at night. There is nothing competing with them. Lack of sleep then reduces emotional regulation. The next day, small concerns feel larger. Your threshold for stress lowers, and the cycle continues. Another interesting aspect is how overthinking affects self-trust. When you question every decision, you begin to believe you cannot rely on your own judgment. You look outward for reassurance. You ask multiple people for opinions. You research endlessly. But even after gathering advice, doubt lingers. Because the real issue isn't lack of information. It's lack of confidence in your internal compass. Overthinking convinces you that one more piece of data will eliminate uncertainty. But certainty rarely comes from external validation. It comes from accepting that you can handle outcomes, even imperfect ones. This is where many people get stuck. They wait to feel fully confident before acting. But confidence often comes after action, not before. If you look closely, overthinking is usually an attempt to avoid discomfort. Discomfort of rejection, discomfort of failure, discomfort of embarrassment, discomfort of loss. The mind believes that by thinking enough, it can experience the pain and soften it. But experiencing pain is still pain. There's a quiet cost to constantly living in rehearsal mode. Life becomes something you prepare for rather than participate in. Conversations feel scripted. Decisions feel heavy. Spontaneity disappears. And yet, beneath all of this, there is usually a thoughtful, intelligent person who simply hasn't learned where to. But change doesn't begin with forcing the mind to stop. It begins with understanding what the mind is trying to protect. In the next part, we'll look at how to gently interrupt the overthinking cycle without fighting your own thoughts, and how small shifts in awareness can begin restoring calm in a very practical way. At some point, you may have tried to force your mind to be quiet. You told yourself to stop thinking about it. You distracted yourself with work, with scrolling, with noise. Maybe you even criticized yourself for being too much in your head. And for a short while, it might have worked. But eventually, the thoughts returned. Sometimes even louder than before. That's because fighting your thoughts gives them importance. The mind interprets resistance as relevance. If you are trying hard to push something away, it must be important. So it holds onto it more tightly. This is why simply telling yourself to stop overthinking rarely works. The solution is not suppression. It's redirection. The first shift is subtle but powerful. Instead of asking, "How do I stop this thought?" ask, "Is this thought useful right now?" That question creates space. Not every thought requires engagement. Some are reminders, some are creative insights, some are genuine problems that need solutions, but many are recycled worries. They offer no new information, they simply replay. When you begin evaluating your thoughts based on usefulness rather than emotional intensity, you regain control. You stop treating every mental event as urgent. One practical way to do this is to separate thinking time from living time. This may sound simple, but it changes everything. If something truly needs reflection, give it a specific window. Sit down, think it through intentionally, write it out if needed. Then, when the thought resurfaces later outside that window, remind yourself that you've already addressed it for now. This teaches your brain that not every moment is open for analysis. Another powerful shift involves your relationship with uncertainty. Overthinking thrives on the need for guarantees. But life offers probabilities, not guarantees. When you demand certainty before acting, you trap yourself in endless preparation. Instead of asking, "What if this goes wrong?" try asking, "If it does go wrong, can I handle it?" That question builds resilience rather than fear. Most of the time, the honest answer is yes. You may not enjoy discomfort, but you can survive it. You have handled difficult moments before. You have adapted. You have recovered. Remembering this weakens the urgency behind overthinking. There's also value in noticing the physical component of rumination. Overthinking is not purely mental. It lives in the body. Tight shoulders, shallow breathing, a clenched jaw. When the body is tense, thoughts accelerate. When the body relaxes, the mind follows. Slow breathing is not just a relaxation technique. It signals safety to your nervous system. And when your body feels safe, your mind reduces its threat scanning. Movement helps too. Walking, stretching, even standing up and changing rooms can interrupt a thought loop. Rumination thrives in stillness combined with mental tension. Physical motion creates a reset. But perhaps the most transformative shift is learning to observe thoughts without identifying with them. There is a difference between "I am anxious" and "I am noticing anxious thoughts." That difference may seem small, but it changes your role. In the first statement, anxiety defines you. In the second, you are the observer. Thoughts become temporary experiences passing through awareness, not permanent truths. When you practice observing your thoughts, you begin to notice patterns. Certain themes repeat: fear of being misunderstood, fear of missing opportunities, fear of disappointing others. Recognizing these themes reduces their mystery. They stop feeling random and start feeling familiar. Familiarity reduces intensity. Another helpful approach is limiting decision fatigue. The more trivial decisions you make daily, the more mental energy you consume. Simplifying small routines, what you wear, what you eat, how you start your morning, preserves cognitive resources. A tired brain is more likely to spiral. Boundaries are equally important. If you constantly expose yourself to information that triggers comparison or anxiety, your mind will naturally generate more material to process. Curating what you consume is not avoidance. It's mental hygiene. It's also helpful to redefine what productivity means. Many overthinkers equate constant mental activity with effort. If they are thinking, they feel engaged. But mental spinning is not productive work. True productivity often looks calm and focused. Action breaks rumination. Even small actions create evidence that you can move forward without resolving every doubt first. And each time you act despite uncertainty, your confidence grows slightly stronger. There is also power in acceptance. Not passive resignation, but conscious acknowledgement. Some questions do not have immediate answers. Some relationships will remain ambiguous for a while. Some decisions will carry risk no matter how much you analyze them. Accepting this does not mean you stop caring. It means you stop demanding clarity where clarity is not yet available. Overthinking often promises relief. It whispers, "Just think a little longer and you'll feel better." But relief rarely comes from extending the loop. It comes from stepping out of it. This stepping out requires practice. Your mind has likely rehearsed rumination for years. It will not change overnight. Some days will feel easier than others. Some thoughts will still pull you in. The goal is not perfection. It is progress. You may begin noticing the moment a thought starts repeating. That awareness alone is growth. You may catch yourself mid-spiral and gently redirect your attention to the present task. That is strength. You may choose to let a message sit unanswered instead of analyzing it immediately. That is trust. Over time, these small shifts compound. Your nervous system begins to calm more quickly. Decisions feel lighter. Sleep improves. Conversations feel more natural because you are actually present. Perhaps the most beautiful change is the return of mental space. When rumination decreases, creativity increases. Curiosity returns. You start engaging with life directly instead of through the filter of anticipation and replay. And you realize something important: Peace was never about eliminating thought. It was about changing your relationship with it. In the next stage of this journey, we'll explore how to build long-term mental resilience so that even when stress rises, your mind remains steady rather than slipping back into old patterns. Real change begins quietly, not with a dramatic breakthrough, not with a sudden moment where your mind goes completely silent, but with small internal shifts that accumulate over time. Mental resilience is not built by eliminating stress. It is built by changing how you meet it. Stress will always exist. Uncertainty will always return in different forms. The real question is whether your mind automatically reacts with spiraling analysis, or whether it can remain steady under pressure. Resilience starts with emotional tolerance. Most overthinking is an attempt to escape discomfort. The mind believes that if it can analyze a feeling long enough, it can solve it. But emotions are not math problems. They are temporary waves. When you allow yourself to feel discomfort without immediately dissecting it, something surprising happens. The intensity rises, peaks, and then falls on its own. If you feel anxious before a meeting, you don't need to mentally rehearse every sentence. You can simply notice the tightness in your chest and let it exist. If you feel uncertain about a decision, you don't need to calculate every possible outcome. You can acknowledge that uncertainty is present and still move forward. The ability to sit with discomfort without reacting impulsively is a form of strength. And like any strength, it grows through repetition. Another foundation of resilience is self-trust. When you overthink, you often assume that your first instinct is unreliable. So you override it. You gather more opinions. You search for reassurance. But constantly outsourcing your decisions weakens your confidence. Self-trust is built through experience. You make a choice. You live with the outcome. You adjust if necessary. You learn that even if things don't go perfectly, you can adapt. This doesn't mean acting recklessly. It means accepting that clarity often follows action, not endless contemplation. There is also a deep connection between identity and overthinking. If you see yourself as someone who is anxious or indecisive, your mind will look for evidence to support that story. But identity is more flexible than we think. You can begin telling yourself a different story, not one of perfection, but one of growth. You can see yourself as someone who is learning to respond calmly, someone who is practicing presence, someone who is capable of handling discomfort without spiraling. Your brain listens to the narratives you repeat internally. Daily structure also plays a powerful role in long-term mental steadiness. When your days have rhythm, your mind has fewer open loops to obsess over. Simple habits like consistent sleep, regular movement, and intentional downtime create psychological stability. It may seem regulation weakens. Small lifestyle adjustments quietly strengthen your mental baseline. Resilience also requires limits. You cannot be constantly available to everyone and expect your mind to remain calm. If you absorb every emotional signal from people around you, your internal world becomes crowded. Setting boundaries is not selfish. It protects your mental energy. Sometimes resilience means choosing not to engage in a debate, not to respond immediately, not to explain yourself endlessly. It means allowing others to misunderstand you without rushing to correct every perception. This reduces the mental replay that follows social interactions. Another important piece is learning to distinguish between what you can influence and what you cannot. You can control your preparation, your effort, your response. You cannot control how others interpret you, how markets shift, how circumstances evolve. When you blur this line, your mind tries to manage everything. When you clarify it, your energy becomes focused. Each time you consciously release something outside your control, you reduce mental friction. Resilience also grows through perspective. When you zoom out, many worries shrink. A single awkward conversation rarely defines a relationship. One imperfect decision rarely ruins a life. The mind tends to magnify short-term discomfort into long-term catastrophe. Gently questioning that exaggeration restores balance. It helps to remember that thoughts are predictions, not prophecies. Your brain is constantly forecasting. Sometimes it predicts danger that never arrives. Treating predictions as facts fuels anxiety. Seeing them as possibilities softens their grip. Gratitude, when practiced sincerely, also stabilizes the mind. Not forced positivity, but genuine acknowledgement of what is working. Overthinking narrows attention to what might go wrong. Gratitude widens attention to what is already steady. This does not deny problems. It balances them. And perhaps the deepest layer of resilience comes from accepting imperfection as part of being human. You will misunderstand someone at some point. You will make decisions that later feel naive. You will miss opportunities. You will feel doubt again. But none of this defines your worth. When you stop demanding flawlessness from yourself, your mind relaxes. It no longer needs to monitor every move so aggressively. Overthinking often fades not because you force it away, but because you no longer feed it with fear of imperfection. Over time, you begin noticing longer stretches of quiet, moments where you are fully immersed in a conversation without analyzing it afterward. Evenings where your mind rests instead of racing. Decisions that feel lighter. You may still think deeply. That part of you doesn't disappear, but the depth becomes intentional rather than compulsive. And perhaps the most meaningful shift is this: you begin experiencing life directly instead of through the filter of constant evaluation. You laugh without replaying the joke later. You try something new without calculating every risk. You let silence exist without filling it with speculation. Mental resilience is not about becoming indifferent. It's about becoming steady. When the next uncertain situation arises, and it will, you won't panic in the same way. You'll recognize the familiar pull toward rumination. But instead of diving in, you'll pause. You'll breathe. You'll decide consciously whether the thought deserves your energy. And in that pause, you'll realize something powerful. Your mind works for you, not the other way around. There comes a moment when you realize that the goal was never to eliminate thought, but to live well alongside it. Even after building awareness, even after practicing redirection and strengthening resilience, your mind will still generate worries from time to time. That's normal. A living mind thinks. A caring person reflects. The difference now is that you no longer confuse mental noise with meaningful insight. At this stage, the real transformation becomes visible not in your thoughts, but in your behavior. You start responding instead of reacting. When a difficult message arrives, you feel the initial surge of interpretation begin. The old pattern whispers, asking you to dissect every word. But instead of immediately diving into analysis, you pause. You let the emotion settle. You respond when you are grounded, not when you are triggered. This pause becomes your quiet advantage. Overthinking used to shrink your world. It made you hesitate. It made you delay conversations, delay decisions, delay action. Now, even if uncertainty is present, you move forward anyway. Not recklessly, but willingly. You understand that progress is built through motion, not mental, sharper words, different choices. Now, you reflect once, extract the lesson, and release the rest. You begin treating yourself the way you would treat a close friend, with fairness instead of harshness. This shift alone reduces enormous mental pressure. Another important evolution is how you relate to other people's opinions. Overthinking often thrives on imagined judgments. You assume others are evaluating you as intensely as you evaluate yourself. But with clarity comes perspective. Most people are too focused on their own lives to scrutinize yours. And even when someone does judge you, you realize something freeing. Their perception does not control your identity. You cannot manage every interpretation. You can only manage your integrity. As this understanding deepens, social situations feel lighter. You listen more carefully because you are not busy calculating how you appear. You speak more naturally because you are not editing every sentence in real time. Presence replaces performance. You may also notice that your energy increases. Mental rumination is exhausting. When that constant background analysis fades, you reclaim attention. That attention can now be invested in meaningful work, deeper relationships, creative pursuits, or simple enjoyment. Clarity creates capacity. And with that capacity comes better decisions. Not because you think longer, but because you think cleaner. You evaluate what matters, gather what is necessary, and then choose. You no longer chase perfect certainty. You accept calculated risk as part of living. The interesting part is that confidence begins to grow quietly from this pattern. Not loud, not dramatic, but steady. Confidence rooted in evidence. You've handled discomfort before. You've survived awkward moments. You've corrected mistakes. You've navigated uncertainty. The mind begins to trust that you can handle whatever unfolds. There's also a deeper layer that emerges: acceptance of unpredictability. Life will not align perfectly with your plans. People will surprise you. Opportunities will appear and disappear. Some outcomes will exceed expectations. Others will disappoint. When you stop trying to mentally control every possibility, you create room for adaptability. Adaptability is far more powerful than prediction. Overthinking once promised safety, but adaptability delivers strength. You begin to understand that peace is not found in certainty. It is found in flexibility. It comes from knowing that whatever happens, you can adjust. This doesn't mean you stop planning. Planning is healthy. Reflection is valuable. Deep thinking remains a strength. But now it is directed, intentional, and time-bound. It serves you instead of overwhelming you. You also become more selective about what deserves your attention. Not every problem is yours to solve. Not every disagreement requires your input. Not every silence needs interpretation. The ability to let things be incomplete becomes a form of wisdom. In many ways, the final layer of growth is simplicity. Your internal dialogue becomes less dramatic. Instead of spiraling into, "What does this mean about my future?" you focus on the next small step. Instead of asking, "Why did this happen?" repeatedly, you ask, "What can I do now?" The present moment becomes your anchor. This presence sharpens your experience of life. Food tastes clearer. Conversations feel richer. Work feels more focused. Rest feels deeper. When your mind is not constantly scanning past and future, the present expands. And perhaps most importantly, you begin to experience quiet without discomfort. Silence used to invite analysis. Now it feels like space. Not emptiness, but room to breathe. Of course, there will still be challenging days. Old patterns may reappear under stress. But instead of feeling defeated, you recognize it as part of being human. You return to your tools. You pause. You observe. You redirect. Growth is not linear. It is layered. Each time you choose awareness over impulse, you strengthen the new pattern. Each time you act despite uncertainty, you weaken the old loop. Over months and years, this reshapes your default response. Eventually, you realize something subtle but profound. You are no longer trying to stop overthinking. You are simply living. And in that living, thinking finds its proper place, not as a master controlling every move, but as a quiet advisor that speaks when needed and rests when not. That is the real freedom. Not a silent mind, but a balanced one. Not a life without uncertainty, but a life no longer ruled by it. And from here, you move forward differently, lighter, clearer, and far more present than before. There is one final layer that most people don't notice until much later. Even after you learn relationship with control, identity, and meaning itself. Because at its core, chronic overthinking is rarely just about thoughts. It is about control. The mind wants guarantees. It wants clarity before commitment. It wants reassurance before vulnerability. It wants to eliminate risk before action. But life does not negotiate that way. It asks for movement first, understanding later. When you truly accept this, something shifts at a very deep level. You begin to see that control was never as strong as you imagined. You never controlled how others felt about you. You never controlled every outcome. You only controlled your effort, your attention, and your response. And strangely, instead of this realization creating fear, it creates relief. If you were never meant to control everything, then you are no longer responsible for everything. This realization softens the constant mental pressure to anticipate every possible future. There is also a quiet maturity that develops here. Earlier, the goal may have been to feel calm all the time. Now, the goal becomes something more grounded, to remain steady even when calm is not available. There will be moments of uncertainty again. There will be situations that stir old insecurities. But instead of interpreting those moments as failure, you see them as reminders to return to awareness. You no longer measure progress by the absence of anxious thoughts. You measure it by how quickly you recognize and release them. This is a profound shift. At this stage, you also begin to value presence more than perfection. You understand that a fully present, imperfect conversation is far more meaningful than a perfectly calculated one delivered from tension. You begin taking emotional risks more willingly, speaking honestly without rehearsing it 10 times, making decisions without endless consultation, allowing others to have their own reactions without trying to manage them. And something unexpected happens. Relationships often deepen. When you are no longer editing yourself constantly, people feel your authenticity. When you are no longer analyzing every response, you listen more deeply. When you are not trapped in your head, you are available. Overthinking once created distance between you and the world. Presence rebuilds that connection. There is also a creative renewal that often follows. Mental space is fertile ground. When your energy is not consumed by rumination, imagination returns in a healthier way. Ideas feel exciting rather than overwhelming. Planning feels purposeful rather than anxious. You begin to trust your natural intelligence again. And perhaps most importantly, you start to experience time differently. Overthinking compresses time. It traps you in past regrets and future fears. Presence expands time. A simple walk feels richer. A quiet evening feels restorative. Even work feels more immersive because your attention is not divided. You realize that much of what you were seeking through analysis, safety, clarity, confidence, was actually available through attention. Attention is power. Where you place it shapes your emotional life. If attention lives in imagined catastrophes, anxiety grows. If attention lives in present action, momentum grows. If attention lives in gratitude, stability grows. This does not mean ignoring real challenges. It means choosing engagement over speculation. There is also a spiritual dimension to this transformation, even if you don't define it in religious terms. When you stop trying to mentally control everything, you create room for trust. Trust in your adaptability. Trust in the unfolding of events. Trust that not everything needs to be forced. This trust does not make you passive. It makes you balanced. You still prepare. You still think. You still care deeply. But you no longer grip so tightly. And that lighter grip changes the quality of your life. You laugh more easily because you are not preoccupied with evaluation. You rest more deeply because your mind is not performing background analysis. You work more effectively because your focus is cleaner. Even difficult moments feel different. When something goes wrong, you address it directly instead of spiraling into, "What does this say about me?" or "How could this ruin everything?" You stay closer to the facts and farther from the story your fear wants to build. This ability to separate fact from narrative is one of the clearest signs of mental freedom. In the past, a single comment might have triggered hours of interpretation. Now, you pause and ask yourself, what actually happened? Usually, the reality is simpler than the story. And over time, this practice rewires your instinct. Your default response becomes grounded rather than dramatic. Eventually, you may look without obsessing, to care without collapsing. That depth is now yours. You will still have thoughts. You will still face uncertainty. But you will no longer be pulled automatically into endless mental loops. You have learned something far more valuable than how to stop thinking. You have learned how to live without being ruled by your own mind. And once you experience that freedom, even briefly, you understand that peace was never about silence. It was about balance. And that balance is something you can return to, again and again, for the rest of your life. There is a quiet confidence that appears when you stop fighting your own mind. It doesn't arrive as a loud breakthrough. It doesn't announce itself with dramatic change. It shows up subtly, in how you carry yourself, in how you respond to uncertainty, in how much space you allow between a thought and a reaction. By now, you understand something fundamental. Your mind generates thoughts automatically, but you choose which ones to build a life around. That realization changes everything. In the past, a single negative possibility could dominate your entire day. Now, possibilities are just that, possibilities. They pass through without anchoring themselves so deeply. You notice them, assess them if necessary, and move on. This creates a new kind of mental strength. Not the strength of constant control, but the strength of selective engagement. You begin to see that peace is not fragile. It doesn't disappear every time a stressful situation appears. It's not something that shatters under pressure. Instead, it becomes a baseline you return to. Think about how different that feels. Earlier, your emotional state may have depended heavily on external outcomes. If someone responded warmly, you felt secure. If someone seemed distant, you spiraled. If a plan worked, you relaxed. If it failed, you replayed it for hours. Now, your stability is less dependent on immediate feedback. You understand that one moment rarely defines the whole story. One reaction doesn't summarize a relationship. One setback doesn't determine your future. This broader perspective protects your energy. There's also a noticeable change in how you approach goals. Overthinking often disguises itself as preparation. You would plan endlessly, research obsessively, consider every risk, and yet, action would feel delayed. Now, planning has a boundary. You gather enough information to move intelligently, and then you move. You accept that adjustments can be made along the way. Momentum replaces mental rehearsal. This shift builds real confidence because it is grounded in evidence. Each time you act despite uncertainty, you prove to yourself that you are capable. Each time you survive an imperfect outcome, your fear loses authority. You begin to internalize a powerful truth. Discomfort is temporary, but avoidance is expensive. Avoidance costs time. It costs opportunities. It costs experiences you could have had if you trusted yourself sooner. As this understanding deepens, courage becomes more natural. Not reckless courage, but grounded courage. The kind that says, I may not have all the answers, but I can handle what comes. There's another quiet transformation happening as well. Your self-talk talk softens. Where there was once harsh analysis, there is now measured reflection. Where there was once constant evaluation, there is now curiosity. Instead of asking, "Why am I like this?" you ask, "What can I learn here?" This shift from judgment to curiosity changes your inner climate. And because your inner climate is calmer, your outer world feels more manageable. You may also notice that your relationships improve without you trying to fix them. When you stop overanalyzing every interaction, you allow space for natural flow. You don't chase reassurance as intensely. You don't assume the worst as quickly. Trust grows. Not blind trust, but earned trust, in yourself and in others. You understand that people are imperfect. Communication is imperfect. Timing is imperfect. But imperfection does not automatically equal disaster. This understanding reduces the urgency that once fueled your rumination. There is a deeper layer still. When overthinking fades, you reconnect with something that was always there: intuition. Intuition is not loud. It doesn't argue. It doesn't present spreadsheets of evidence. It is quiet, steady knowing. But overthinking often drowns it out. When the mind is noisy, subtle signals are hard to hear. As your mental noise decreases, your intuition becomes clearer. Decisions feel less forced. You sense when something aligns and when it doesn't. You no longer need to debate endlessly because you trust that inner signal more. This does not mean you ignore logic. Freedom in not checking your phone repeatedly for reassurance. Freedom in not replaying a conversation before sleep. Freedom in not assuming that silence means rejection. Freedom in making a choice and letting it stand. These moments may seem small, but they accumulate into a different quality of life. Overthinking once convinced you that vigilance was necessary for safety. Now you understand that constant vigilance was draining the very life you were trying to protect. You no longer confuse anxiety with responsibility. You recognize that thinking has its place, during planning, during reflection, during meaningful decisions. But outside of those spaces, you allow yourself to simply exist. And in that existence, something powerful happens. You become more creative, more patient, more focused, more emotionally available. You stop trying to solve life before it unfolds. Instead, you participate in it. There will always be unknowns ahead. There will always be moments where your mind attempts to return to old habits. But now, you have awareness. You have tools. You have experience. You know the difference between productive thought and repetitive worry. You know when to engage and when to release. That discernment is maturity. And as you continue forward, you'll notice something almost surprising. The life you were trying to secure through endless analysis becomes available through presence. Not because everything is perfect, but because you are no longer fighting every imperfection. You are steady, you are capable, and most importantly, you are free enough to let your mind rest, not in silence, but in balance. There is a point where growth stops feeling like effort and starts feeling like alignment. In the beginning, managing overthinking required awareness, discipline, and conscious interruption. You had to catch the spirals. You had to redirect your attention. You had to remind yourself that not every thought deserved engagement. It felt intentional, sometimes even tiring. But now something quieter happens. You don't have to work as hard to stay grounded. The pause between thought and reaction appears naturally. The urge to analyze every detail weakens on its own. What once felt like constant internal noise becomes occasional background sound. This is integration. The mind has learned a new pattern. You may notice that when uncertainty shows up, your first instinct is no longer panic. It's assessment, calm assessment. You look at what's in front of you instead of racing toward worst-case scenarios. You ask practical questions instead of catastrophic ones. What can I do right now? What is actually within my control? Is this thought helping me? These questions arise almost automatically because you've practiced them enough. And with that practice comes a deeper realization: peace was never something you had to chase. It was something you uncovered by removing unnecessary mental resistance. There's also a greater sense of proportion in your thinking. Earlier, small problems could expand quickly. A delayed reply might have felt like rejection. A minor mistake might have felt like failure. Now, events remain closer to their true size. A delay is just a delay. A mistake is just a correction. A disagreement is just a difference. You no longer inflate ordinary experiences into defining moments. This steadiness changes the way you move through the world. Decisions feel cleaner because they are not clouded by layers of imagined consequences. Conversations feel lighter because you are not preoccupied with performance. Even solitude feels different, not as a space for rumination, but as a space for restoration. There is a kind of quiet enjoyment that returns when overthinking fades. You begin appreciating ordinary routines. A walk becomes simply a walk, not a backdrop for mental replay. A meal becomes nourishment, not a time to evaluate your day. Even rest feels deeper because your mind is no longer running simulations in the background. And this enjoyment is not dramatic. It is subtle, stable, sustainable. You may also find that your energy shifts toward creation rather than protection. Overthinking is protective by nature. It tries to shield you from potential harm. But once that protective instinct relaxes, energy becomes available for building rather than guarding. You might pursue ideas that once felt too uncertain. You might express opinions more openly. You might step into opportunities without rehearsing every outcome. This is not recklessness. It is grounded confidence. There is another important shift here: forgiveness. Not just forgiving others, but forgiving yourself. For the years spent trapped in loops. For the moments of hesitation. For the missed chances. You begin this self-forgiveness lightens you even more. You also stop labeling yourself so rigidly. You are not an overthinker. You are a person who once relied heavily on thinking as protection. That distinction matters. Identity shapes behavior. When you loosen the label, you loosen the habit. As time passes, you may encounter people who are still caught in constant rumination. You'll recognize the tension in their speech, the way they analyze simple events, the way they seek reassurance. And instead of judging them, you'll understand. Because you remember. And that memory keeps you humble. You know that the mind can always return to old patterns under stress. That's part of being human. But now you have awareness strong enough to notice the early signs. A tightening in the chest. A familiar repetitive question. A late night spiral beginning to form. Instead of getting pulled under, you gently step back. You breathe. You return to the present. And in doing so, you protect your balance. This final stage is not about achieving a permanently quiet mind. It is about building a reliable relationship with it. A relationship based on guidance rather than control. Your thoughts are advisors now, not dictators. Some will still be useful. Some will still require attention. But many will pass through without attachment. And because of that, your life feels less crowded, less cluttered, more direct. You respond to what is real instead of what is imagined. You act when action is needed and rest when it is not. You allow uncertainty to exist without trying to erase it. And perhaps the most beautiful outcome of all is this: you trust yourself. Not because you know everything, but because you know you can handle not knowing. That trust is freedom. It is quiet. It is steady. It does not need constant reassurance. And once you experience it fully, you realize something simple yet profound. You were never meant to think your way into peace. You were meant to live your way into it. One grounded decision at a time. One present moment at a time. And from here, life no longer feels like a problem to solve. It feels like something to experience. At the very end of this journey, something subtle but profound becomes clear. The real shift was never about silencing your mind. It was about redefining your relationship with fear. Overthinking was never random. It was fear trying to protect you. Fear of failure. Fear of rejection. Fear of regret. Fear of losing control. And for a long time, your mind believed that constant analysis was the best way to stay safe. But safety built on endless mental rehearsal is fragile. It depends on predicting the unpredictable. It depends on preventing every mistake. And that is an impossible task. Now, you understand something deeper. Safety does not come from controlling outcomes. It comes from trusting your capacity to respond. That difference changes the way you live. Instead of asking, "How can I make sure nothing goes wrong?" you begin asking, "If something goes wrong, how will I respond?" That shift moves you from prevention to preparedness. And preparedness is empowering. You no longer need perfect conditions to feel steady. You can walk into conversations without scripting them. You can make decisions without dissecting every angle. You can let silence exist without filling it with interpretation. You can allow people to have their own moods without assuming responsibility for them. And in doing so, you reclaim something that overthinking quietly stole from you: your natural rhythm. Life has a rhythm when you are not constantly interrupting it with analysis. Conversations flow, work progresses, rest restores, emotions rise and fall naturally. There is movement instead of stagnation. Overthinking created friction in that rhythm. It paused moments that didn't need pausing. It magnified small uncertainties into major concerns. It turned ordinary experiences into puzzles. Now, you let experiences unfold. This doesn't mean you stop reflecting. Reflection still has value. It's how you grow. But reflection becomes intentional rather than compulsive. You choose when to think deeply instead of being dragged into it automatically. That choice is freedom. There is also a new relationship with time. You stop trying to mentally live in the future before you arrive there. You stop rewriting the past as if it can change. Your attention settles more fully into what is actually happening. And when attention settles, anxiety softens. You realize how much of your previous stress came from living in imagined scenarios. The body would tense for events that never occurred. The mind would prepare for conversations that never happened. Entire emotional responses were built around fiction. You also stop seeking constant reassurance. You don't need to check and recheck every signal. You don't need repeated confirmation that everything is okay. You begin to tolerate ambiguity without panic. Ambiguity becomes neutral instead of threatening. And because you tolerate ambiguity, you become more courageous. You try things without guaranteed outcomes. You express yourself without rehearsing every word. You allow others to misunderstand you occasionally without scrambling to correct every perception. You begin to see that discomfort does not equal danger. This understanding makes you more open to growth, more open to connection, more open to opportunity. The mind that once fixated on what could go wrong now has space to consider what could go right. Not in a forced positive way, but in a balanced way. You no longer assume disaster as the default outcome. And even when challenges appear, because they always do, you approach them with steadiness rather than spiraling. You assess the facts. You decide your next step. You move forward. No endless replay. No identity crisis. No catastrophic narrative. Just response. This is emotional maturity in its quiet form. You begin to trust that you don't need to mentally solve your entire future tonight. You don't need to extract every lesson immediately. You don't need to understand everything at once. Life can unfold gradually. There is a deep peace in allowing that unfolding. And perhaps the most beautiful realization of all is this: the mind you once struggled with is not an enemy. It is intelligent, imaginative, protective. It simply needed guidance. Now, instead of fighting it, you collaborate with it. You listen when something truly needs attention. You ignore it when it drifts into repetition. You rest when your body asks for rest. You act when action is clear. Balance replaces battle. In this balance, you rediscover a sense of lightness that may have felt distant for years. You wake up without immediate mental pressure. You move through the day without constant self-evaluation. You go to sleep without replaying every interaction. Not because life became simple, but because you did. You stopped complicating what didn't need complication. You stopped analyzing what didn't require analysis. You stopped assuming that thinking more would protect you more. And in letting go of that belief, you gained something much greater than control. You gained presence. And presence, in the end, is what makes a life feel real. Not perfect, not predictable, but real. And from here forward, when uncertainty knocks, as it always will, you won't meet it with panic. You'll meet it with steadiness. Because you now understand something essential. You don't need to overthink your way through life. You can simply live it. There is one final truth that ties everything together. The mind will always think. That is its nature. It will generate ideas, replay moments, imagine futures, scan for risk, seek meaning. You cannot turn that machinery off completely. And you don't need to. The real transformation was never about stopping thought. It was about remembering who is in charge. For a long time, it may have felt like your thoughts were happening to you. Like you were being pulled by them, controlled by them, defined by them. A single worry could hijack your mood. A single doubt could derail your confidence. A single imagined scenario could consume hours of your day. Now you see it differently. Thoughts arise, but you decide whether they stay. That distinction is quiet but powerful. You understand that the mind offers suggestions constantly. Some are useful, some are protective, some are simply echoes of old fears. Your role is not to obey every suggestion. Your role is to evaluate them calmly. Is this thought helping me right now? If yes, you engage with it intentionally. If not, you let it pass. This skill, this simple discernment, is what separates mental noise from mental clarity. And clarity changes how you experience your entire life. Oh, you are no longer searching for perfect certainty before taking action. You no longer require universal approval before speaking honestly. You no longer need every outcome mapped in advance. You trust your ability to adapt. That trust is the foundation of real confidence. Earlier, confidence may have felt like something you needed to build before acting. Now you understand that confidence grows because you act. Each decision made without endless rumination strengthens it. Each uncomfortable moment handled without spiraling reinforces it. You stop waiting to feel fearless. You move while feeling human. There is also a deeper acceptance that settles in. You accept that your mind will occasionally wander into old patterns, and you return to the present. That return becomes easier every time. Eventually, you realize that peace is not fragile. It doesn't depend on perfect thoughts. It depends on your relationship to those thoughts. You can have anxious thoughts and still be calm. You can have doubts and still act decisively. You can have uncertainty and still move forward. Because you are no longer waiting for your internal world to be flawless before living your external one. This is freedom in its most grounded form. It is not dramatic. It is not loud. It does not need to be announced. It shows up in small ways, in how quickly you let go of minor frustrations, in how lightly you hold future plans, in how fully you listen when someone speaks. It shows up in how you forgive yourself. The version of you who once overanalyzed everything was not broken. That version was trying to survive in the only way it knew how. Now you have grown beyond that strategy, not by force, but by understanding. And understanding dissolves fear. As you continue forward, you may notice that life feels more spacious. There is room between events, room between thoughts, room between reactions. That space is where choice lives. And choice is where power lives. You choose what deserves your energy. You choose what deserves your time. You choose which thoughts are worth building upon. Everything else can pass through. In that passing, your mind becomes lighter. In that lightness, your body relaxes. In that relaxation, your life opens. You stop treating every moment as a problem to solve. You stop treating every silence as a threat. You stop treating every uncertainty as a warning. Instead, you meet life as it is, unpredictable, imperfect, dynamic. And you realize that you are equipped for it. Not because you have all the answers, but because you have learned how to live without needing them all at once. That is the quiet mastery at the heart of this journey. Not control over every thought, but calm authority over which thoughts guide your actions. From here, there is nothing dramatic left to fix, nothing urgent to resolve, only the ongoing practice of awareness. You breathe, you decide, you act, and you let the rest unfold, not with indifference, but with steadiness. And in that steadiness, you discover something that overthinking could never give you. A mind that works with you, a life that feels present, and a freedom that does not depend on perfect certainty, only on your willingness to keep showing up, grounded and aware, one moment at a time. And after everything settles, after all the strategies, insights, and shifts, what remains is something surprisingly simple. You are still you. You still think deeply. You still care. You still reflect. But now, your thinking is not heavy. It is not compulsive. It is not driven by quiet panic. It is deliberate. There is a difference between a mind that is searching for danger and a mind that is exploring life. One is tense. The other is curious. One narrows your world. The other expands it. You have moved from tension to curiosity. Curiosity is powerful because it does not demand certainty. It simply asks questions without attaching fear to the answers. When something unexpected happens, you don't immediately jump to worst-case conclusions. You wonder about it. You gather information. You respond calmly. That shift alone changes your experience of nearly everything. Earlier, you may have tried to mentally solve your identity. Am I good enough? Am I doing enough? Am I behind? Am I making the right choices? These questions once echoed loudly. They carried pressure. Now, identity feels less like a fragile structure that needs constant defense and more like a living process. You are allowed to evolve. You are allowed to change your mind. You are allowed to grow beyond previous versions of yourself. Overthinking often tries to freeze identity in place. It wants certainty about who you are and where you are going. But life unfolds in stages, and your ability to adapt to those stages matters more than having everything figured out. There is peace in allowing yourself to be unfinished. You no longer rush to define every experience. Not every setback needs a dramatic meaning. Not every success needs to prove something about you. Sometimes things simply happen. Sometimes they are stepping stones. Sometimes they are lessons. Sometimes they are just moments. And that simplicity is freeing. You also begin to notice how much quieter your internal environment feels. The constant commentary that once narrated every action has softened. There is more silence between thoughts. More space to breathe. That space becomes sacred. In that space, you can hear you. Instead of asking, what will prevent regret, you begin asking, what aligns with who I want to become? That question leads to action rooted in growth, not avoidance. And when you live from values rather than fear, even mistakes feel different. They become feedback, not verdicts. Another quiet shift is how you experience waiting. Waiting used to be uncomfortable. Unanswered messages, pending outcomes, delayed clarity. The mind would fill the gap with speculation. Now, waiting feels neutral, sometimes even peaceful. You understand that not knowing is part of the rhythm of life. You don't rush to fill every empty space with explanation. You allow time to do its work, and in doing so, patience strengthens. This patience extends to yourself as well. You no longer expect immediate mastery over your thoughts. On days when your mind feels louder, you don't panic. You return to the basics: awareness, breath, presence. You know the way back. That knowledge creates deep security. There is also more gratitude now, not forced optimism, but quiet appreciation. You notice when your mind stays calm in situations that once would have triggered spirals. You notice when you respond thoughtfully instead of reactively. You notice how much lighter your days feel. These observations reinforce the new pattern. Over time, this becomes your default. You wake up and your first thought is not worry. You face challenges and your first instinct is not catastrophe. You make decisions and your first reaction is not doubt. The mind that once felt like an unpredictable storm becomes more like weather you understand. Sometimes cloudy, sometimes clear, sometimes restless, but no longer frightening. And perhaps the deepest layer of all is this: you no longer see yourself as someone who needs to be fixed. That belief was subtle but powerful. It fueled so much mental analysis. If you could just think enough, plan enough, improve enough, maybe you would finally feel secure. Now you understand that security was never about perfect thinking. It was about self-acceptance. You accept that you are human, that you will sometimes worry, that you will sometimes hesitate, that you will sometimes misjudge, but you also accept that you are capable, resilient, adaptable, and that acceptance quiets the urgency. Life continues to unfold, opportunities appear, relationships evolve, challenges arise, but you meet them with steadiness instead of spiraling. You don't need to control the entire path. You only need to take the next step. And when you look back at who you were, the version of you trapped in endless loops of thought, you may feel compassion rather than frustration. That version was doing its best with the tools it had. Now you have better tools. Not complex ones, not dramatic ones, simple ones. Pause, observe, choose. And with those simple steps, you've changed the entire quality of your inner world. That is the quiet transformation at the heart of this journey. Not a different life, but a different way of living it. Steady, present, unburdened by unnecessary mental weight. And from here forward, whenever your mind begins to wander too far ahead or too far back, you know what to do. You return to this moment, to your breath, to the simple truth that you don't have to think your way through every step. You can just take it. And in the end, what stays with you is not a technique, not a rule, not even a specific mindset. What stays with you is a new relationship with your own mind. You no longer treat every thought as a command. You no longer treat every doubt as a warning. You no longer treat every uncomfortable emotion as a problem that must be solved immediately. You allow your inner world to move without constantly trying to manage it. That is the quiet maturity that settles in after everything else. There was a time when your mind felt like a courtroom. Every decision was on trial. Every word you spoke was examined. Every outcome was evidence of success or failure. The inner dialogue was relentless, always presenting arguments, always cross-examining your choices. Now, the courtroom is empty, not because you stopped caring, but because you stopped putting yourself on trial. You understand that growth does not require constant self-interrogation. It requires awareness and action. And awareness does not need to be harsh. It can be calm, gentle, observant. This gentleness becomes one of the most powerful changes of all. When you are gentle with yourself, your nervous system relaxes. When your nervous system relaxes, your thinking becomes clearer. When your thinking becomes clearer, your decisions become stronger. It is a cycle, but now it is a healthy one. You may begin to notice how much time you once lost, and what replaces it is not emptiness. It is presence. Presence while working. Presence while listening. Presence while resting. Presence while doing nothing at all. There is an understated richness in that presence. Life feels fuller, not because circumstances changed dramatically, but because your attention did. Attention is life. Where you place it determines what you experience. Before, your attention often lived in imagined futures or reconstructed pasts. Now, it lives here, in the conversation in front of you, in the task at hand, in the breath moving in and out. And in that shift, something remarkable happens. Time slows down. Moments stretch just enough for you to actually experience them instead of evaluating them. You laugh without analyzing how you sound. You speak without editing every sentence mid-delivery. You make decisions without consulting 10 hypothetical outcomes. This doesn't make you careless. It makes you free. Free from the illusion that more thinking equals more safety. Free from the belief that certainty must come before movement. Free from the constant need to mentally prepare for every possible version of tomorrow. You begin to understand that life is not meant to be fully predicted. It is meant to be navigated. And navigation requires awareness, not obsession. There is also a deep, quiet confidence that forms when you stop trying to outrun uncertainty. You realize that uncertainty is not a flaw in life's design. It is part of it. It creates growth. It creates discovery. It creates opportunity. Without uncertainty, there would be no courage. And you have learned courage, not loud, dramatic courage, but steady courage. The courage to act without overanalyzing. The courage to rest without guilt. The courage to let conversations end without replaying them. This courage reshapes your identity in subtle ways. You are no longer the person who overthinks everything. You are the person who notices thoughts and chooses wisely. That identity feels lighter. And as you carry that lightness forward, you realize something beautiful. You don't need to reach some final destination where your mind is permanently silent. You don't need to achieve a state of perfect calm. You only need to keep practicing awareness. Because awareness is enough. When worry appears, you notice it. When doubt appears, you question it gently. When fear appears, you sit with it without surrendering to it. And then you return to living. That return, again and again, is the real skill. Life will continue to present unknowns. Relationships will evolve. Goals will shift. Unexpected changes will come. But you now carry something stable within you. Not certainty, but steadiness. And steadiness allows you to meet whatever comes without collapsing into endless mental loops. You have learned that peace is not the absence of thought. It is the absence of struggle against thought. It is the willingness to let the mind do what it does while you remain anchored in the present. And anchored in the present, you discover that most moments are far simpler than your mind once made them. A conversation is just a conversation. A mistake is just a moment. A delay is just time passing. You stop adding unnecessary layers. And without those layers, life feels breathable. That is the final transformation. Not a different world, but a clearer way of seeing it. And as you move forward from here, you carry this clarity quietly. You don't need to announce it. You don't need to prove it. You simply live it. One decision at a time. One breath at a time. One present moment at a time. And that is more than enough. And if there is one last thing to understand, it is this. The journey was never about becoming someone new. It was about returning to who you were before fear convinced you that constant thinking was necessary for survival. There was always a steadiness inside you, a natural rhythm, a basic ability to handle life as it came. Over time, layers of doubt and mental habit covered that steadiness. You mistook those layers for intelligence, for responsibility, for preparation. But beneath all of it, you were already capable. Now, with the noise reduced, you can feel that again. You notice how little actually requires overanalysis. Most conversations resolve themselves. Most decisions are adjustable. Most problems are manageable once faced directly. The mind once exaggerated their size because it believed exaggeration equaled protection. It doesn't. Direct engagement is far more powerful than endless rehearsal. You also begin to recognize how much energy you've reclaimed. Mental energy is subtle, but it shapes everything. When it is tied up in loops, life feels heavy. When it is free, life and authenticity has its own quiet strength. You no longer try to anticipate every reaction from others. You no longer adjust yourself constantly to avoid hypothetical rejection. You express what feels true and allow the rest to unfold. Some people will resonate, some won't. And that's okay. That acceptance alone dissolves a tremendous amount of overthinking. You also stop assuming that every discomfort is a signal that something is wrong. Sometimes discomfort is simply growth. Sometimes it's unfamiliarity. Sometimes it's just part of being alive. You don't rush to eliminate it. You sit with it. And because you sit with it, it moves through you faster than it ever did when you tried to analyze it away. There's a deeper freedom here, the freedom to be imperfect in public. To say something slightly awkward and not replay it all night. To try something new and not dissect every small mistake. To make a choice and trust that you can adjust later if needed. That freedom makes life feel lighter. You may still plan carefully for important decisions. You may still reflect thoughtfully on meaningful moments. But the compulsion is gone. The urgency is gone. The belief that you must think endlessly to be safe is gone. Now, thinking is a tool you use, not a force that uses you. And because of that, you become more decisive. Not because you rush, but because you recognize when enough reflection has happened. You sense when further analysis would only repeat what you already know. You act, and then you move on. This ability to move on is powerful. It prevents stagnation. It keeps you present. It protects your energy. You stop building mental museums of past mistakes. You stop forecasting disasters as if they are guaranteed. You stop treating uncertainty like an emergency. Life becomes more fluid. there is also a quiet gratitude that emerges for the process itself. Even the years of overthinking taught you something. They showed you how much you care, how deeply you reflect, how strongly you want to do well. Now that care is balanced with calm. Now that reflection is paired with action. Now that caution is tempered by courage. And perhaps the most grounding realization of all is this: you never needed to control everything to be okay. You only needed to trust that you could handle what comes. That trust has been built step by step, through pauses, through awareness, through choosing not to follow certain thoughts, through acting despite incomplete certainty. It is not dramatic, but it is durable. As you continue living with this new steadiness, you may rarely think about overthinking again. It will no longer define you. It will no longer dominate your days. It will simply be something you once experienced and outgrew, not because you forced your mind into silence, but because you stopped believing every thought required your loyalty. And in that release, you found balance. You found presence. You found a way of moving through life that feels grounded rather than guarded. From here on, when thoughts arise, as they always will, you greet them with calm recognition. Some you will follow, some you will let pass. And that simple discernment will keep you steady. You don't need to overthink your future. You don't need to dissect your past. You don't need to solve every unknown tonight. You only need to stay aware, to stay present, to take the next step in front of you, and trust that the rest will unfold, not perfectly, not predictably, but manageably. That is enough, more than enough. And when everything you've learned settles into something steady and lived in, you begin to notice that life feels less like a puzzle and more like a path. Not a perfectly straight path, not one without obstacles, but a path you can walk without constantly scanning the horizon for every possible storm. There was a time when your mind believed vigilance was wisdom. It believed that by staying mentally ahead of everything, you could avoid pain. But now you understand that pain is not always preventable, and more importantly, it is survivable. That understanding softens you. You no longer brace for impact at every small uncertainty. You no longer assume that silence means rejection or that delay means disaster. You give situations room to breathe. You give people room to be human. And you give yourself room to exist without constant correction. That space changes your internal atmosphere. You wake up without immediately checking for problems. You move through your day without needing to mentally audit every interaction. When the evening comes, you rest more easily because your mind is no longer rehearsing tomorrow. The difference is subtle, but it transforms everything. You begin to experience trust as you don't need to suffer it in advance. That is one of the greatest freedoms of all, no longer suffering events that haven't happened. Overthinking once made you feel prepared, but it often left you drained. Now you understand that true preparation is simpler. It's showing up well, rested. It's being present. It's responding clearly in the moment. It's not endless mental rehearsal. There's also a quiet dignity in this way of living. You no longer scramble for reassurance. You no longer chase clarity that time will naturally reveal. You stand calmly in the unknown when necessary. And that calmness speaks louder than any overanalyzed explanation ever could. You may even notice that others respond differently to you. When you are grounded, conversations become steadier. When you are not projecting hidden anxieties, interactions feel cleaner. When you are not over-interpreting, misunderstandings shrink. Your inner balance subtly shapes your outer experience. And perhaps the most meaningful shift of all is this: you stop trying to earn peace. There was a period when you may have believed peace would come once everything was solved. Once the right decisions were made. Once the right assurances were given. Once the future was secure. But peace was never waiting at the end of perfect planning. It was waiting behind the release of unnecessary mental struggle. You don't need to deserve calm. You don't need to achieve it through flawless performance. It becomes available the moment you stop demanding that your thoughts guarantee safety. You start living more directly. When something needs attention, you address it. When something is outside your control, you let it be. When a thought adds no value, you release it. Simple, grounded, effective. This simplicity becomes your strength. You understand that complexity often lives in imagination, not reality. Most situations are manageable when approached step by step. It is the mental layering, the what ifs, the interpretations, the worst case projections, that makes them overwhelming. Without those layers, life feels breathable again. And as you move forward, you carry this awareness quietly. You don't need to constantly remind yourself of it. It's integrated. It's natural. There will still be moments when your mind speeds up. There will still be nights when uncertainty feels louder. But those moments no longer define you. They are temporary weather patterns, not permanent climates. You return to center more quickly now. You know how. You pause. You observe. You choose. Not with tension, but with calm authority. And over time, that calm authority becomes your default. You don't chase certainty anymore. You don't chase perfection. You don't chase complete control. You walk forward with enough clarity for the next step, and that is enough. Life remains unpredictable. People remain complex. The future remains unwritten, but you are no longer trying to solve all of it at once. You are participating in it, fully, presently, without the constant background noise that once convinced you something was always about to go wrong. In that presence, there is a quiet joy, not excitement, not intensity, just steadiness. A mind that thinks when needed and rests when not. A heart that feels without overanalyzing every sensation. A life that moves without being dissected. And from here, there is nothing left to fix. Only moments to experience. Only steps to take. Only a steady awareness guiding you forward. Not perfectly, not fearlessly, but freely. And that freedom is the real end of overthinking. Not because thoughts disappear, but because they no longer control the direction of your life. And when you stand at this point, after all the awareness, all the practice, all the quiet internal shifts, you begin to see something almost ironic. The peace you were chasing through constant analysis was never hidden in some complex mental formula. It was always available in simplicity. For so long, your mind believed that thinking harder meant living better, that if you could just anticipate every possibility, and participation requires presence, not prediction. Now, when you look at the world around you, it feels less threatening and more open. You understand that uncertainty is not a flaw in the system. It is the system. It is what allows growth, surprise, learning, connection. Without uncertainty, there would be no courage. Without unpredictability, there would be no discovery. You don't try to eliminate uncertainty anymore. You walk alongside it. There's a deeper confidence in that posture. It is quiet. It doesn't need validation. It doesn't need to prove anything. It simply exists because you have lived through enough to know that you can handle what comes. That knowledge can't be forced. It's earned. Earned every time you chose action over endless rumination. Earned every time you allowed discomfort without spiraling. Earned every time you trusted yourself despite incomplete information. And now that confidence feels natural. You no longer feel the urge to mentally rehearse every conversation. You no longer replay small mistakes as if they define you. You no longer assume that silence hides danger. Instead, you interpret events with balance. A delayed message is just a delay. A brief awkward moment is just that, brief. A difficult decision is simply a crossroads, not a catastrophe. You see things closer to their true size. That clarity brings a kind of emotional economy. You stop spending energy where it isn't needed. You stop investing hours into imagined problems. You reserve your focus for what is real and actionable. And because your focus is no longer scattered, your life feels more intentional. You listen more fully. You work more deeply. You rest more honestly. There is less background noise interrupting everything. You also notice that your sense of identity has shifted. You are no longer someone defined by anxiety or overanalysis. You are someone who is aware. Someone who is deliberate. Someone who can step back from a thought instead of being consumed by it. That identity feels grounded. It doesn't require perfection. It doesn't collapse under pressure. It bends when needed and holds steady when necessary. You've learned that mental strength isn't about suppressing fear. It's about seeing fear clearly without surrendering to it. You've learned that clarity isn't about having every answer. It's about knowing which questions matter. You've learned that peace isn't about a silent mind. It's about a balanced one. And perhaps most importantly, you've learned that your thoughts are not your destiny. They are passing interpretations. Some are useful. Some are outdated. Some are simply echoes of old habits. You get to choose which ones shape your actions. That choice is the real freedom you were searching for all along. As you continue living with this awareness, life doesn't suddenly become perfect. There will still be complex situations, emotional conversations, unexpected turns, moments of doubt. But those moments no longer trap you in endless loops. You face them, you respond, you move forward, and then you let them go. There is a calm rhythm to that process. A natural flow that doesn't require constant mental interference. You realize that life moves best when you don't try to engineer every step. Sometimes the most intelligent thing you can do is trust the process of living itself. Trust that clarity will emerge in motion. Trust that mistakes will teach you. Trust that discomfort will pass. Trust that you are capable of adapting. This trust doesn't eliminate challenges. It simply prevents them from multiplying in your imagination. And in that simplicity, you find something deeper than control. You find ease, not laziness, not indifference. Ease. The ease of knowing you don't need to live every possibility. The ease of making decisions without dissecting them for days. The ease of allowing silence without interpreting it. The ease of resting without guilt. When you reach this place, overthinking no longer feels like a defining trait. It feels like a phase you moved through, a habit you outgrew, a strategy you replaced with something wiser. And what replaced it is not complexity. It is awareness. Steady, grounded, present awareness. From here forward, you will still think. You will still reflect. You will still care deeply. But you will not be ruled by repetition or fear. You will be guided by clarity. And that clarity will continue to shape your life quietly, consistently, moment by moment. Not through force, but through balance. And that balance is enough.